you hear me in the back? Good, excellent. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Clyde Wendell, and I have the privilege of serving as chairman of the Truman Library Institute. And on behalf of President Truman's legacy, as well as the Presidential Library and Museum in Independence, I'd like to welcome all of you to the 7th presentation of the Truman Medal of Economic Policy. The Truman Medal was created in 2005 to recognize individuals who have made extraordinary contributions to the formation of economic policy, while also acknowledging the significant impact our hometown president, Harry S. Truman, had on the American economic system. President Truman was confronted by daunting economic challenges throughout his time in office. In the months following the Second World War, President Truman and his advisors faced a number of domestic economic challenges and obstacles, including the conversion of a wartime economy to a sustainable peacetime economic expansion, refinancing the national debt that had grown enormously during the war, and stimulating economic growth post the massive industrial output that had focused on a war effort. In response, President Truman and his administration created a number of economic programs and institutions that resulted in the realignment of the American economic priorities and addressing the expectations of the American people. In terms of that domestic policy, Truman administration's most significant and lasting contribution may well be the creation of the Council of Economic Advisors and the Monetary Accord of 1951, which gave the Federal Reserve the ability to use monetary policy to help manage the health of the national economy. Truman also faced unprecedented international challenges across the devastated Europe and Asia. The President and his advisors pushed for and succeeded in strengthening and expanding the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. I encourage all of you in attendance to visit the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum in Independence to learn more about these incredible decisions that our favorite son of Missouri took. The Truman Medal of Economic Policy ceremony is organized through a partnership between the Harry S. Truman Library Institute, the UMKC Henry W. Block School of Management, represented by Dean Brian Klass, the Missouri Council of Economic Education, represented by Dan Thornton, and the Economic Club of Kansas City, represented by its president, John York. Thank you all for your efforts and continued support of this meaningful award. I'd also like to recognize the Truman Library Institute's Executive Director, Alex Burton, and Dr. Kurt Graham, Director of the Truman Library and Museum in Independence. On behalf of all of our partnering organizations, I would like to thank our platinum sponsors, Americo Financial Life and Annuity Company, the Economic Club of Kansas City, and our gold sponsor, Commerce Bank. These and our other sponsors are noted in your program. We're also grateful to the J.E. Dunn Construction Company and the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation for their generosity in endowing the award back in 2005. Please join me in thanking all of these sponsors. I now have the distinct honor and privilege of introducing Esther George, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, who will present the Truman Medal of Economic Policy Award. In her position, Esther George, as the CEO of the 10th District Reserve Bank, headquartered here in Kansas City, has eloquently and passionately told the story of our district on behalf of the businesses and bankers here in the Midwest. And she is also a member of the Federal Open Market Committee. Please welcome to the stage Esther George.
The Truman Medal for Economic Policy was established to recognize and reward an individual for meritorious contribution to the field of economics as a researcher, educator, or public servant. And I'm so pleased that the award this year is being given to Dr. Robert Shiller. Dr. Shiller is the Sterling Professor of Economics at Yale University. He received the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences jointly with Eugene Fama and Lars Peter Hansen in 2013 for their empirical analysis of asset prices. He is also widely known for creating, along with Carl Case, the Case-Shiller Index, which is a leading measure of U.S. residential real estate prices. Dr. Shiller is one of the most influential economists of our time for his body of work that has contributed importantly to the field of economics. It is my pleasure to present the Truman Medal for Economic Policy to Robert Shiller.
Well, I'm very honored to receive this medal. Now, I'm not from Missouri, but I think President Truman has always had a place in my heart as an honest and effective person. And he was president when I was born. So he's sort of... What I wanted to talk about on this occasion is the importance of narrative in the formulation of economic policy. This comes from, well, it actually relates to the book that I wrote, published in 2015, third edition, Irrational Exuberance. But I've been thinking about that first came out in 2000, but I've been thinking about it now for decades. And I thought when I was invited to give the presidential address to the American economists, I thought maybe this is the time for me to suggest a redirection of economic thinking. I looked at other presidents' addresses, and I found that they often tried to do that. That's what a president does, criticizes the society that elected him. So what I felt is that economics needs more attention to human stories. Stories, and often with associated theories, the idea that the story matters and is important. So called narratives. Economists like to talk about economics in a pure sense. If anyone changes his or her behavior, they'll say, well, maybe they were looking at the rate of interest. I'm looking at Esther here. What you do will affect people's decisions. Of course, that's right. Also, they look at their income and their taxes, all these parameters that are set by public policy figures. But I had a feeling that economists maybe go a little bit too far with that. And that there's other things that matter, and that is the stories of our time. And that actually the public figures are often doing their most important work when they just talk. Now, I was afraid I would be booed by the economists when I gave this talk, but nobody booed. And in fact, I got some compliments for this. So the idea is that economics has to start listening more to people and their stories. People's sense of identity is tied up with stories. Who I am, where my life is leading, what my purpose is. The next thing I've been thinking about over the years is about epidemics. Like disease epidemics, but epidemics of ideas and stories. Stories can be contagious. In fact, there's a popular expression nowadays, going viral, okay? That stories they're like a virus. If they're contagious, they spread from one person to the next. I discovered later that going viral is just a new name for an old idea. Back in the 19th century, Gustave Le Bon, psychologists talked about idea microbes because they hadn't discovered viruses yet, but it's the same idea. And so I think what I decided to do is name this as a field or a subfield. Narrative economics is about stories. And studying narratives means listening to people. What stories are they telling now? And understanding history means going back and trying to understand history from the standpoint of what were they talking about. I finally discovered a historian, Ramsay McCulloch, who wrote a book called History as Feelings, going back to try to discover what people were feeling in various times in history, but the way he does that is by listening to their stories. So that's my general intent here, is to talk about... I did a count. By the way, we live in a big data world now, so we can count things, and we can track ideas. So one idea is just the idea of the narrative at a point in time as something important to study and to understand. So I used JSTOR, which is a database of scholarly journals, and I searched for the word narrative to see how often they appear in journals in different fields. And I did it both for all dates, which goes back to the founding of the journal, sometimes in 1890 or something like that, and I did it since 2010. And you can see that economics is the second worst field in terms of appreciating the importance of narrative. The worst field is finance. And the best fields, anthropologists go and listen to primitive tribes, or they study kinds of societies, but they listen, and they're really good at narratives. And so are the history people. And every field is getting more narrative focused since 2010. So I think there is some emerging enlightenment. You can't understand how people behave until you study their narratives. Now, I'm trying to bring Harry Truman as a supporter of this idea. In a sense, he is. That's a picture of from the Truman Library. I got it off the website. That's Harry Truman and Bess, almost cut off in the picture, at the White House. And what are they doing? Reading books. So I've been reading about Harry Truman, trying to appreciate him better. I understand that he was not a particularly good student. Nonetheless, he read constantly, and he particularly liked history. So history, I think, does involve a lot of narrative study. A lot of people wonder how Harry Truman arose from relatively unexceptional life to become President of the United States. I have a theory. I don't know how much it overlaps with others. And that is that he had a sense of reality. Reading history and listening to others' accounts of how people were thinking at different times gives you a sense of reality. That's part of the story anyway, which is power if you understand how things work. Now, here is a plot of the unemployment rate in the United States from 1890 to 2017. I'm just showing this is what we worry about as economists. It's very spiky, isn't it? Every one of these spikes up is a recession. But there are two really big outliers here. You know what this is called here? The Great Depression. And this here, what is it called? Maybe you have trouble. You forgot this one, probably most of you. This is the Depression of the 1890s. When it happened, it was the biggest depression ever recorded, but it was eclipsed by this one. unemployment rate got up to something well over 20%, and this one only got up to something like 12 or 13% for a number of years. But here's the thing. Some events are remembered and others aren't. Some of them go viral. This event really went viral, and we really all know about the Great Depression. But this one, we have dim memories of. By the way, this spike, I thought I should mention, since we're talking about Harry Truman. That's when his haberdashery business went bankrupt. And so it was kind of a bad time for him. So I wanted you to think about your memories. See, all of these events probably have lessons for us, but we just don't remember them because you have only limited space for narratives. So I'm asking you to think about these two depressions. I don't know if any of you have memories of this one. It's not that long ago, right? But I'll give you a couple of cues for your memory for these. Anyone recognize this photo? This took place in Kansas, by the way. You ought to remember it. You know who that is. This is the Depression of the 1890s, and that's what's left of it in our memories. Yeah, this is Dorothy, the Scarecrow, the Cowardly Lion, the Tin Man, and this is President William McKinley, otherwise known as the Wizard of Oz. I'm telling you, this is the Depression of the 1890s. This is all you have left in your memory of that horrible experience. L. Frank Baum wrote the book, The Wizard of Oz, and published it. I mean, he lived somewhere around here. Did he live in Missouri or Kansas? I don't know. Out east, it's all a blur. Somewhere around here. Did someone know? L. Frank Baum was a Silverite that wanted bimetallic standard. And he didn't like McKinley, so he made him into the Wizard of Oz. If you remember the Wizard of Oz, this guy is fake, right? He turns out to be a big phony. He published this book in May of 1900, right at the beginning of the election between Bryan and McKinley. So this is a political tract from 1900. And by the way, it was so popular that in 1902, there was a smash Broadway musical called The Wizard of Oz. And then in 1939, this movie was made with Judy Garland as Dorothy. But now this, you remember, does anyone recognize this picture? Yeah, it's a famous photograph. This is what we remember of the Depression of the 1930s. This photograph was taken by Dorothea Lange, chronicling the suffering of the Great Depression. So I think that our memories of the Depression are so much more vivid. And this is like a childhood memory. It doesn't match up with reality. They both went viral, but crucial details of this one just got lost. And now we think it means little or nothing. Or it's a warning, it has moral. Hearts will never be practical until they can be made unbreakable, okay? Something like that. This is a count for, and I like to do big data, and I like to search for how things vary through time. This is a Google Ngrams count of The Wizard of Oz, the Depression of the 1890s, and 1890s Depression, just wording it differently. What this does, it shows for each year the percentage of words in books that are published in that year that contain these words. So you can see how much we think what is really important. The Wizard of Oz is like 10 times more important than the whole Depression of the 1890s. It's just hardly there in our memories. So But the Great Depression outdoes them all. This is just totally is not the right emphasis. But you can see the Great Depression is 10 times bigger than the Wizard of Oz. Now, I feel a little embarrassed talking about the Wizard of Oz in a seminar on economics. But that's what economists have to do, because it's things like this that animate people and motivate them. So I did a count. Now, I have two different counts here. One of them is based on Google Ngrams, but you can hardly see it. Google Ngrams ends in 2008, so I can't go beyond that. But the other one is ProQuest News in newspapers. Again, I'm counting how many times a phrase appeared in newspapers as a percent of articles. The term Great Depression, it's been growing kind of irregularly since the Great Depression, but right now it had a huge bump up. Oops, I didn't want to do that. You know what that year is? 2009. That was our financial crisis. What this tells me is that the legends can grow in importance for decades or even centuries beyond, if they go viral, if they become contagious enough, they can grow and grow. And they become, the contagion of the idea is affected by the events. And if we have this terrible financial crisis, everyone was afraid it was the Great Depression again. And remember that Dorothea Lange photograph that I showed you? That's what we thought might be coming. So it seems to me that economists, in trying to understand the dynamics of business cycles, they have to think about this kind of dynamics. What happened in the Great Depression was that people became fearful. Remember, President Roosevelt said the only thing to fear is fear itself. They became afraid of being judged adversely by spending extravagantly. They became conservative. They pulled back. And there was uncertainty about government policy. Stories about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as his administration wore on into its fourth term, was starting to get negative. And businesses weren't willing to invest. But all these things are narratives. So now here I'm coming back to Harry Truman again. The Great Depression started after the stock market crash of 1929, and then it lasted for more than a decade, until World War II. It seemed like they couldn't get out of the Depression. But miraculously, now of course we got out of the Depression for World War II because there was so much spending on the war. In fact, the unemployment rate got down practically nothing. Everybody was working during the war. But economists worried during World War II that after the war, we'll just sink right back into the Great Depression again. And it's one of the great mysteries that we didn't. Something changed. And I'm just using, I was trying to, Harry Truman became president in 1945, just before the end of the war. And I thought perhaps, I don't think there's any received doctrine about why we didn't go back into the Depression. But I thought perhaps it has something to do with our president, Harry Truman. So I have a little clipping from a newspaper article from 1946, which is right here. And it's Harry Truman talking reassuringly to people about, this is talking about fears of communist spies in the United States. So Harry Truman is addressing the American people, saying that his reading of history shows that people are fearful for a while after wars, and they exaggerate things like this. And he's recommending that you go back to 1792 to 1801. He wants you to read about the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were kind of post-war, post-Revolutionary War hysteria. So here is President Truman. He's not doing what Herbert Hoover did, just saying we're going to have prosperity again soon. He's directing you to read about something. He comes out as a truthful person, and he's telling you that it's really we're not going to hell. You just had that up here on the screen. I think he came across as a truthful man, but also someone who would tell stories. But they're the stories told by someone who reads extensively, and they're not show-off stories. Somehow that is part of our recovery after the Great Depression. One interesting thing about Truman is that I mentioned that his haberdashery business failed during the Depression of 1920-21, which was a very important depression. Do you know what? According to David McCulloch's book on Truman, Harry Truman could have declared bankruptcy and canceled his debts. But he was a moral man. He wouldn't do that. He felt he was morally obligated to pay his debts. It took him 15 years to pay off the debts that he incurred from his small business. So here, that's a narrative. That's a story. It gives you a very different feeling than you get from some other presidents. Okay. So this is something that started happening in the 1950s. This is actually 1958, so we're moving beyond the immediate post-war period. But I think that the story, the narrative of World War II in our minds was completely different from the narrative of the 1920s, which preceded the Great Depression. And I can't completely define this, but the 1920s was a fun time. You had flapper girls, people were drinking, and the Great Gatsby, lots of fun. Here, before 1958, the narrative was World War II and people heroically dying for their country. It led to a different spirit in the country. So I'm just mentioning the suburbs, the movement. We had a lot of these little houses, all identical. You know these. This is Levittown, a famous suburb. But people who've studied the Levittowners say that there was some spirit among them which is more equality. They would say, I don't need to be a rich person. We have a wonderful neighborhood. People care about each other. We're all in identical houses, but it's so what? A sense of community. And I think this explains, in some, I can't prove it, but I'm thinking it helps explain why we didn't go back into the Great Depression. So now I want to talk about speculative prices. This is my plot of the stock market. You can find it on my website. I keep updating it. The blue line is this Standard & Poor Composite Stock Price Index from 1871 to the present, and the green line is corporate earnings from 1871 to the present. And you may have noticed, this is in real, it's usually not done corrected for inflation, but even though it's corrected for inflation, we are at a record high. What drives this? Okay, well, the traditional economists would say earnings, which are a representation of what the companies are making, that's the green line, or maybe interest rates. But I think that they're probably wrong. It's neither of those things, although those things influence it. But the more important thing are stories, narratives. So if you look here, this is the 1920s. The stock market was growing way up until 1929, and then it crashed. According to my real numbers here, it's lost about 80% of its value in less than 3 years. Now you could say that it should have, because the earnings were down. Well, earnings weren't down as much as the stock market. You can see they fell from here to here. But earnings are they're affected by the Great Depression. It's not an exogenous force. So it seems to me that there is a change in our culture and a change in our morality that occurred, and a change in our stories that are told that brought on the Great Depression. So there's a famous passage. John Maynard Keynes was probably the most famous economist of the 20th century. You could debate that, but he invented Keynesian economics. And one of the chapters was about the state of long-term expectations. And he claimed that business doesn't know the future, so we really can't predict the future, but we can observe each other's predictions of the future. And that affects things like the stock market. So the famous passage was his beauty contest. It's just a paragraph in the book, but it's quoted time and time again. So he said he saw in a newspaper, or he's seen these in newspapers, a kind of contest. But this was before the Miss America pageant, I think, or maybe it had already started, but a different kind of beauty contest. What the newspapers were printing, in the first stage, which I don't show here, is a page with 100 photographs of pretty faces. And you are invited to mail in, you're supposed to pick the 6 prettiest, in your opinion, and mail that into the newspaper. Then they'll take all the entries that were mailed in, and they'll calculate who were the 6 most popular. And you win if your 6 comes closest to the 6 most popular. So what Keynes said, well, if you think about, and this is from an actual newspaper, the Washington Times, in around 1907, which was the winners of one of those contests. So how do you play this game? Remember, they're not competing, you're competing. You're competing to predict the most popular. So you don't want to pick the 6 prettiest faces in your opinion. Obviously, you want to win the contest. You want to pick the 6 faces that you think that other people think are prettiest, right? But no, that's not right either, because those other people are doing the same game. So what you should do is pick the 6 faces that you think that other people think are the prettiest. He said the stock market is like that. You're not going to buy some good company unless you think that the public is going to come around to paying more for it. So what is the optimal strategy in this world? Well, some economic theorists have been wondering about it. But I think speculative markets have a crazy streak because we're all following each other without a real leader. Now, I had a column yesterday in the New York Times in the Sunday business section talking about the 30th anniversary. Well, came out just a few days after the anniversary. Did you know that 30 years ago, we had the biggest one-day drop in the stock market in world history? President Reagan set up a commission called the Brady Commission to tell him what happened, why it happened. They wrote a solemn report. It didn't talk about narratives. And I thought, well, on that occasion, I decided to do a survey myself of investors on that day, because nobody else is going to ask them what their stories are, what they were thinking. And I was right. Nobody else in the world did it. So I stayed up all night for 2 nights in a row, right after this event of October 19th, 2017. And I did a survey. And I interpreted my results as confirming, yes, people were selling because they thought other people were selling. And that's it. That's all it was. And, well, they had some background stories that, that colored their thinking and made them more vulnerable to selling when you see other people selling. But I said in my column that I thought this was resembled a episode which was in the news last year of a false shooting. It was at LAX airport in Los Angeles, And all of a sudden, everyone started running. And people, because there had been airport shootings, people were afraid. And they see other people running, they get scared too. But there was no shooter. Maybe something made a noise, and somebody thought it sounded like a gun. But it caused this mass panic. I think it's the same thing then. So what happened in the stock market, so we were primed by certain stories to react to each other's fears. So one of the stories that I talked about, which I documented in my survey as important, was the story about a fancy new way of hedging your risk in the market called portfolio insurance. A couple of UC Berkeley professors talked it up, and it became I would call it a fad. The other thing was the people thought the stock market looked a lot like the stock market up to 1929. And the morning of October 19, 1987, the Wall Street Journal published I should have made it one of my slides, published a comparison of the Dow Jones Industrial Average now in 1987 for the last 7 years with the Dow Jones Industrial Average for 1929 in the last 7 years, openly inviting a comparison with the Great Depression. So this Great Depression story keeps coming back, and there are times when it makes you primed to react. And that's what I think happened. You can read my column. It's on the New York Times website still. But I just don't think that the Brady Commission left you with the impression that maybe portfolio insurance did it mechanically. But I don't think it was mechanical. It was human. And it was, let me just say, oops, I'm going backwards. I lost my train of thought for a moment. This is housing prices, which Esther mentioned. I've constructed home price indexes for the United States with Carl Case. Our indexes go back to somewhere around here, but I extended my series back to 1890 in the book that you have. Some of you have. I saw some of you with these books. So you see this enormous spike up in between 1997 and 2006. And you see almost no parallel for that in US history. Well, there's this one parallel. This is Harry Truman, by the way, it just occurs to me. This is the end of World War II. You see there was a big bid up in home prices at the end of World War II. I think there's something happening which is not comparable to, there's something in our national spirit that caused us to do this. So suddenly the war was over. It was a nightmare. It was over. Actually, it wasn't so clearly over because the Korean War started. People were rushing to buy houses. They wanted to live normally. This, I'm thinking, is the narrative. They didn't want World War III. They were talking about World War III already, right around here. There was looking at this, I want to talk about narrative. What were they thinking? What were they talking about? What's the narrative here? It's totally different. It's something about, I think it has something to do with getting ahead. There's lots of different aspects of it. You've got to be in the right neighborhood. Your children have to be associating with the right people. It's worth it to buy a house in a glamorous place. Not a Levittown feeling at all. It's also awareness of rising inequality. There isn't the satisfaction with relative equality that people felt after the war. It left to an entirely different bubble. So here's about stories. Social scientists have argued that the human species could best be defined as a storytelling species. And in fact, 3 different scholars independently suggested we change the name of our species. We're called Homo sapiens. which in Latin means wise man, or man wise. So these people all said, let's change it to homo narrans, homo narrator, or homo narrativus, meaning man the narrator. Because that's what every human society does. So I love this book. It came out in 1955 by Alfred Steichen, called The Family of Man. It's a book of candid photos grouped by narrative, I guess. Something happened. But he shows for each narrative, or each human event, he shows the same event happening in different cultures. So you can see that we're all the same. That's the theme of the book. All people are basically the same. So this is a storyteller telling a story to, this is in Botswana, what's now called Botswana. You look at this picture and you say, I know exactly what's happening here. You have a feeling what his story, he's telling some wonderful story to children. And this woman here, you can't see her too well, is laughing at the story. Human interest stories are part of the culture of all countries, of all human societies. Oops. On the other hand, some people think economists should stay out of this. So Irving Kristol was a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and in 1977, he was saying that these so-called confidence indices are supremely silly. He said business people are not affected by confidence. It's what Mr. Carter, that was our president, and Mr. Burns, that was the head chairman then, it's what they do that counts, not what they say. And Keynes in his beauty cycle story may have still had some followers, but he thinks it's ridiculous. He thinks that economists have a poor opinion of the intelligence of businessmen, who they regard as temperamental children to be paternalistically managed. Well, I thought he did an excellent job of expressing the view. I don't have this view. I don't think businessmen should be insulted if someone tries to understand their mistakes, because they want to understand their mistake. No one's saying that they're less intelligent. They're just people, and people are affected by narrative. There's a lot of studies the problem with economics is you can't do a controlled experiment. I mean, we can't go on and say, let's try to raise interest rates to 10% and see what happens. We can't do that. But other fields can. And there have been a lot of studies that show the importance of narratives. So, I mean, for example, in journalism, Marcel Marchil and co-authors staged the same news story, the same news, the same content, but different presentation. And then they quizzed people afterwards on what they got from the story. So version A, this was a news story about environmental pollution. And they had a scientist stand up and talk about levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or something like that. That was BA. People just didn't get any of it. The version B focused on a man who is a baker and who has asthma. And he had a bad asthma attack. And then he started to feel motivated to change this and to fight those corporations that are polluting the air. People got it. You've got to put it into a story. And these, I won't go through all of these, but people respond to stories. So here's a model of contagion that I like to use, which is a medical model. This is from a medical journal article from 1927, Mathematical Epidemiology. I'm sorry to put equations up here, but it basically, oh, there's a typo. This should say recovery rate. Contagion rate, recovery rate. There's two parameters. How contagious is this illness? And that's C. And R is how fast do people recover from it. If you're contagious, you're only contagious until you recover. So I won't go through these differential equations, but I can tell you what the outcome is, that an epidemic looks like this. This is number of infected. This is even if the contagion rate and the recovery rate are absolutely constant. So we introduce one person out of 100 who's infected. The number of infected people rises and then falls. It has a hump-shaped look to it. And the contagion rate, if you can have big epidemics and small epidemics. Depending on these two parameters, you can have an epidemic that infects everybody, 100% or almost 100%. Or you can have an epidemic that never reaches above 1% of the population. And you can have fast epidemics and slow epidemics. It all depends on the contagion rate and the recovery rate. So this should be the model for inflationary, or not just for economic dynamics that economists use. So as an example, I just looked at various economic theories. You don't know these because these ISL, maybe some of you got ISLM in college. But they all have, these are 4 different economic theories, and they all have a pattern through time. This is from the year, it's hard for you to read, 1930 to 2008. They go up and then they go down. This is Paul Samuelson's multiplier accelerator theory. It goes, it went viral, okay? He won the Nobel Prize too. Fortunately, they awarded it before he fiddled out. If you look up names of people, you get the same thing. It's depressing to think that's what life is. The famous people that you think of are eternally famous. They're not eternally famous. They're only at some phase in the speculative viral. Art Laffer wrote a famous Laffer curve. I won't get into what that is. It was an economic theory. It had it had a high contagion. I won't get into this, I'm short of time. But Jude Wanniski wrote up a story of the lunchtime event when Art Laffer wrote the curve on a napkin. He just told the story so well. I'm just trying to understand, what is it about certain stories? Good writers know how to go viral. But it faded away in 10, 20 years until something, here's a case where the contagion rate isn't constant. Something brought Art Laffer back. Have you seen him in the news lately? He's back. But his Laffer curve is more famous than he is. And he can't control it. These things go viral, and they're just out there. So I think I do mention Donald. I was trying to stay away from politics. Current politics. But do you remember, in the 1890s, go back to the 1890 Depression, everyone was talking about bimetallism. I always used to wonder, what's interesting about that? William Jennings Bryan versus William McKinley. It's in the Wizard of Oz, the yellow brick road. That's the gold standard. It's symbolic of what they were talking about bimetallism like we're talking about Bitcoin nowadays. It just was a viral story. And then Donald J. Trump really mastered the art of going viral. Did you notice how much people talk? They don't all like him, but they all talk about him. So, this is some themes that I've looked at through time, and I see they're kind of irregular, but I see them as if they were infections. Autosuggestion, I don't have time to get into that. It was a fad in the early 1920s. Oops. Okay. These are a little bit hard to read. The green thing is business confidence, which was not talked about in the 19th century. Then it started building up in the 1880s, 1890s. It got really high during the Great Depression, and then it's been sagging a little bit since. This is robots. Again, you can't. I'm standing right here, and I can't. Don't feel bad. Your eyes aren't going. This is 1800. There was a tremendous spike in the use of the word robots around 1980. Why is that? The best I can figure out was this. This was the Star Wars trilogy, which had the brilliant idea of creating cute robots. And so they this narrative has been transformed, and it's part of our narrative now about fear of robots. These are nice robots, but we don't always have nice robots. So this is, okay. Fear of robots has been with us for 200 years, but the narrative changes and is transformed. In the 19th century, they didn't have the word robot yet, but they had machinery that were replacing jobs, and they called it labor-saving machinery. And that's this red line. It was a slow epidemic of concern that peaked around the Great Depression. Then they invented a new word for it called technological unemployment, and that went through a huge going viral. Part of what was happening in the Great Depression is that people thought that they were obsolete. Machines were replacing them. Now here's my favorite story about going viral. You know this man? That is Karl Marx, the father of communism. I was reading a book by Mark Skousen about history of economic thought, and he claims that you think of Marx as the author of the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and that was when he sprung onto the scene. But we learned nobody read that. He was nobody until later. According to Skousen, I didn't know if I completely believe this, Karl Marx first became famous when a friend of him named Kugelmann gave him a copy of this bust of the Greek god Zeus and told Karl Marx, you know, you look like Zeus. And so Karl Marx sat down with his wife Jenny and said, yeah, I really do look like Zeus. And so Kugelmann was saying, go for it. Grow your beard out like that. And you know what? He did it. And I don't know if I believe Skousen's story, so I found two more biographies of Marx, and they both said the same thing. So Marx is just a big, godlike man, and he decided to play it up. And here's his sidekick, Friedrich Engels. What an enormous beard. Do you know this guy? Louis Blanc, another communist. Totally, well, maybe, does any of you know of him? His most famous quote was, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. But that quote is now falsely attributed to Karl Marx, because this guy just doesn't fit the narrative. So, this is a Google Ngrams count for Zeus and Karl Marx. Now, by the way, Zeus does not exist, okay? That doesn't mean he can't go viral. So you notice how much Zeus has grown. Zeus was very low, but look at him soaring. He reached a peak around 1890, and he's sagging since. This is something that the literary historians will tell you is the classical revival. Back in 1800, nobody even knew who Zeus was. You imagine that everybody knows the king of gods, Zeus. But we don't worship, nobody worships Zeus. He just has a special place as a story. Karl Marx timed itself perfectly. He died in 1883. That's Karl Marx. He was beginning to be known with his Zeus routine. And he almost reached Zeus. He peaked in 1975. So, and now he's fading. But it happens to all of us. Even Zeus is fading. Oh, this is Einstein and Schrödinger. Einstein and Schrödinger both did breathtakingly important research in physics that challenged our thinking. But Einstein looked like Zeus or something. Schrödinger, nice-looking guy, or average guy. So I did a count of, look at how much more famous Albert Einstein is than Erwin Schrödinger. So here's some more names. William McKinley, William Jennings Bryan, Donald Trump. Oh, I put Hugh Hefner in. He had the audacity, his main claim to fame, in my opinion, is he had the audacity to appear in public in silk pajamas and a bathrobe. And anybody who does that stands out. There's nobody dressed like that here, right? You have to do things like that to create a story, but most of the time it fails. You have to be Hugh Hefner or Albert Einstein to do it. But anyway, that brings me to Truman again. Truman had decided to, Roosevelt, because the nation was in a crisis, did regular fireside chats. He called them fireside chats on the radio, talking directly to the American people on a one-on-one sort of friendly basis. Truman had to decide whether to do it or not. He did it so that people were listening regularly to his radio broadcasts. And they had a feeling for him as a friend with his plain-spoken style, his kind of erudition, knowledge of history, and honesty. It came across as a Truman narrative. Every single US president has kept this tradition alive now, every one of them. This is President Obama, he, by the way, became famous, I think, through his book, Dreams from My Father, which is a very well-written book that draws you in. Again, so the Obama story is a narrative story. He does the, by the way, if you don't get them on the radio anymore, you go to YouTube, and they're visual as well. And she brings Michelle in, warm, this was their Christmas speech to the nation, not speech, their fireside chat. You see the fire in the background? And Trump is doing it too. So Trump is my best example of the power of narrative. Now his weekly radio or YouTube broadcasts are not getting a big audience, but he's more successful. You might have heard on Twitter. I give him credit in this. He actually appeared in a photograph with Meredith McIver, who wrote his book. And he thanks her in the fine print. He wrote a book, Trump, How to Get Rich. And now this might seem audacious to put your own name as the name of your book, but that's what he did. But I think Meredith McIver is pretty good at capturing him. You know, you can interview someone and watch them, and then you can speak like them. So she wrote a lot of this book, I'm sure. He acknowledges that in the fine print. But what is his advice? How do you get rich? I'm quoting our president here through Meredith McIver. I've read stories in which I'm described as a cartoon, a comic book version of the big city business mogul with the gorgeous girlfriend and the private plane and the personal golf course and the penthouse apartment with marble floors and gold bathroom fixtures. But my cartoon is real. I am the creator of my own comic book, and I love living in it. If you're going to think big. If you're going to live large. Well, that may be some good advice. I'm not entirely sure, but it really shows that our presidents are people who appreciate the power of narratives. So this is the end of my talk. I think that national leaders have to have an appreciation of narratives and of Keynesian-style beauty contests, which drive many things, and the contagiousness of narrative. Let me just close with a couple of examples from our financial crisis. One was in the UK in 2007. A bank called Northern Rock failed, and there was starting to be a run on the bank. There was photographs in newspapers of crowds forming outside Northern Rock Bank, because they were afraid that the bank would go under and they wouldn't get their money. So Alistair Darling Alistair Darling was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Mervyn King was Governor of the Bank of England. They immediately said, we're bailing everybody out. No depositor has to worry. And no limit. Their deposit insurance limited at £35,000, which is not a lot of money for a lot of people, if they have their retirement savings in there. We're bailing it all out because Britain had not had a bank run since 1866, and they didn't want one now because it would start a very destructive narrative. Then a year later, we had the money market fund, the reserve primary fund, started to fail. And there was, it looked like a bank run forming on money market funds. And then President George Bush and Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson issued a statement, we're bailing them all out. Now this seems contrary to economic thinking, and maybe we don't want to do this too often, but when you can see that, you see the Great Depression narrative looming, and you don't want to let an example happen, because then it may go viral and threaten the whole banking structure. So that's my conclusion, is that policy leaders should be less shy to interpret narratives and try to understand them. Thank you. So, are we having questions? We are having questions. But you have to go to a microphone, and the microphones are
I've been an investment banker since 1975.
I can't even see what's with the bright lights. Are you talking?
Well, I was going to ask a question, if I may.
Hi, good evening. I've been an investment banker since 1975 and worked through the crash in '87 and many years. We've gone through multiple cycles over the years. My daughter is 30 years old, and she's starting on a second career very soon. How should she invest her money?
Okay, that is a big question. So, I am not a licensed financial advisor. And I think that you should get, your daughter should get a financial advisor, because it differs for, everyone's different and in different circumstance. But general rules are to diversify, don't plunge in one investment. And people really do that. Yale University, where I work, in 1825, put the entire Yale endowment in one investment, the Eagle Bank, and it failed. So Yale was completely wiped out. And it survives only with the generosity of other people. Don't do that. Even Yale University can be stupid like that. It comes, you can get, the Eagle Bank narrative must have sounded awfully good, but it in truth was not. Okay.
Oh, yes. My question doesn't really have to do with the narrative theme, but it has to do with your article. And the thing that I was thinking about when I was reading your article was, you were talking about the price-earnings ratio and how high they are now. And I was wondering about the theory of shareholder value and how companies look at shareholder value and they have to keep their stock prices up, so they buy their own stock back.
Oh, right.
And I wonder what effect this has been having on the market.
Okay, this is a very technical question, but I'll try to address it quickly. Until 20 or 30 years ago, companies never bought their own stock. In fact, you might have, what is this doing? A company buying its own? What if it bought all of its own stock? Where would it, does the company disappear? Well, they won't be able to buy all their own stock, because somebody is going to realize that if they bought 99% of it and I own the 1%, I own the company. So it's a complicated story, but I think it does put some bias on to price, a small bias on price-earnings ratios, and it's a new trend in corporate finance. Maybe I'll stop with that, because it's kind of a mathematical problem. So, okay, yeah, here.
Just quick feelings from you on regulation right now. There's a lot of talk about regulation with the large internet companies. What's your feeling on regulation? And secondly, any comments about blockchain right now?
Yeah, okay. Regulation. I wrote a book with George Akerlof called Fishing for Fools, The Economics of Manipulation and Deception. And it was a plea for some regulation. We don't want to be too big, too much regulation. There is a problem with regulation, though, which we didn't really cover in our book, but I wrote about it in some other, one of my columns, that regulators are often interested in putting on new regulations, more interested in that than on taking off old regulations. And this is, well, Donald Trump is behind taking off old regulations. And I think he might do it more wholesale than I would. But there has to be some expiry date, some time. Congress tried to pass a law that made regulatory agencies do this, but they find it hard to do. So maybe we do have a little bit too much regulation in some dimensions, but in other dimensions we'll always need regulation. So maybe over here now.
My question has to do with the post-war boom in the housing market. How much of that do you think could be contributed to individuals coming back and utilizing things such as VA loans and their Montgomery GI Bill?
Right. Well, at the end of the war, Congress passed called the GI Bill, which gave, they wanted to make sure that veterans could afford a house. So that is part of the story. But it's also part of the narrative. So it's hard to disentangle. But part of the narrative was that we were a grateful country. It was amazing how we lost, what, 350,000 men and women in that war. And people had a sense of others' kindliness to each other. And so the GI Bill was one manifestation of that. The other thing that was, well, the other thing that was happening was that we were entering the nuclear age, and the Soviet Union tested an atomic bomb in 1949. That led to a huge demand for moving to the suburbs, away from central cities, and bid up prices there, at least, I believe. So maybe we'll move to, yeah.
Well, you know, McKinley didn't last very long. He was followed by a guy by the name of Roosevelt, right? He was shot by an anarchist.
Yeah, that was an unfortunate story. McKinley was assassinated and replaced by his vice president, the other Roosevelt,
Yeah,
Teddy Roosevelt.
They
yeah.
thought they would put him in a place where he wouldn't cause much trouble.
They thought Teddy, but he was a great president, right, Teddy?
Oh, yeah. My question to you is, who are the job creators? Are they the upper class, the middle and lower class? Which of those two groups are the real job creators in our economy?
Well, I don't use those words, upper, middle, and lower class. I suppose if I had to say, it would be all three of them are involved in job creation. I don't know where you're going with this.
Wouldn't you think that the upper classes or the 1%, their money ends up being offshored?
Well, I don't view America as that much of a class society. Europe is more class. We were founded, actually, a very good book to read, which you can find online for free, is Thomas Paine's book, Common Sense, which was published in 1776, I think it was. And it's very readable. And one thing that is really nice about his book, I think, is his imploring you not to believe these social class. People used to think that the upper classes were really superior, and it isn't true. Don't believe it. So Paine's book went viral, by the way. It may have caused the Revolutionary War. It sold like 1 million copies in colonial America. And so reflecting the American dream, although it wasn't called that for much longer. So who's next? Okay, yeah.
Well, since I can't be elected president.
You can't?
No. Who would, if I were, or let's say the next president, who would you depend upon to help you discover these narratives? Now, I know there have been presidents who've read 5 or 6 newspapers a day, but most of them don't. So where are these, how is this president, with all of his other duties, going to have these narratives brought to his mind, to his attention?
I'm suggesting, well, when I addressed the American Economic Association, I was addressing them as researchers and thinking that there is formal research that can be done quantifying the impact of narratives. I wanted to, so this is talking to researchers who would then form societies and discuss, and then be an advisor to the president. So I was thinking of, nobody looks at sermons anymore. What about church sermons? I'd like to see, I've been asking around to get, where can I get a database? And also other religion, not just Christian. I did manage to look at what sermons were on the Sunday after the stock market crash of 1929. Guess what? Moralizing about being too concerned with wealth. But not just that, also diaries, as well as newspapers. We have all kinds of digitized
but would you,
discussion.
excuse me, would you appoint a council to
Well, then you do, we already have a council of economic advisors.
and would
And
they,
as a professional understanding of the economy gets more rich, I think we can do better. Now, already, Ben Bernanke was chairman of the Federal Reserve. He was an economist, not particularly narrative-based, but sort of, because he wrote a book on the history of the Great Depression. So he knew all the stories, and I think he must have had some sense. So I think he was a good Fed chairman. We need someone like that who has, again, the problem with narratives is that it's human and it involves judgment. So when you try to imagine what is influencing someone to think a certain way, and it's not theoretical physics. It's not, the computer won't tell you whether this person is honest or not. At least not for a long time they won't. So it's a matter of, this also gets back at the sciences versus the humanities. There's been a division between scientists and literary types that has been very strong. But maybe we have to, maybe these scientists should read a novel sometime or think about other aspects of human experience. Okay. Thank you.
Congratulations, Dr. Schiller. You have honored us by accepting the Truman Medal of Economic Policy and your thoughtful remarks. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this evening's presentation. Thank you for attending.